South Africa's railway system is on the verge of total collapse. This is attributed to the theft of kilometers of electric cables, vandals carrying away tracks and signaling equipment, and general vandalism of workstations. Let's now speak to the author of the report, David Williams. He's a railway expert and former journalist. Mr. Williams, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to The Full View.
Good evening, Simpiwe.
Mr. Williams, you say that about 66% of overhead electrical cables on about 3,000 kilometers of railways that are part of PRASA are out of order due to vandalism. Now, this hasn't been an overnight exercise, but it was years of desecration of our railway systems. Why was it seemingly allowed to happen and disintegrate without taking action in the early stages?
Well, that's perhaps the core question that you've asked there, Simpiwe. The decline in PRASA, let's talk PRASA, because on the one hand we have Transnet, which is freight rail, goods traffic, and then we have PRASA, which is passenger rail, and they are separate, which is part of the problem. But if you go back to passenger rail 20 years ago, the decline in passenger numbers started. So there's been a steady decline over 20 years in the number of people travelling by train. One of the problems has been safety. The Railway Safety Regulator has repeatedly warned that the operations by PRASA, passenger rail operations, are not safe for passengers, partly because the trains themselves are not operated as they should be, and partly because passengers on the trains are not safe. In other words, they get assaulted, they get raped, they get robbed, and there was a steady decline in the number of people travelling on train. COVID-19 last year, in 2019, the epidemic started in March, but before that, PRASA was really in a bad way. But what happened during the lockdown was that what security there was on railway lines and stations and so on was withdrawn, partly because of a dispute between PRASA and the security companies, partly because of governance issues. The minister dismissed the board, and of course when a board goes and a new board comes in, a lot of things are not looked after. So during the lockdown last year, from March onwards, there was whole-scale looting of the infrastructure. And in Gauteng, for example, there are 480 or so kilometers, 480 kilometers of commuter line, and almost all of them have had their equipment stolen, which means the trains can't run. Cape Town, it's similar. Durban, it's similar. So effectively, this has been a crippled organization with hardly any trains running. If you were to apply the concept of load shedding to PRASA, if it was the equivalent, we would say that they've got 24 hours virtually of load shedding a day. They're just not functioning.
Well, there's been a total of 1,833 incidents of vandalization at the train stations in Gauteng alone over the past 3 years, at a replacement cost in excess of about 2 billion rand, if I'm not mistaken. And you mentioned in the report that engineers estimate that it'll cost about 500,000 rand per kilometer to restore the overhead electrical cables. Considering the extent of the damage already, the cost could be greater, couldn't it?
Well, that's right. I mean, that's just the overhead equipment. So the electric locomotives that drive all the commuter trains, they need their electricity from the overhead wires, and most of those have been stolen. So has signalling wires. So in some places have the tracks, the actual rail lines themselves, been stolen. So it's one thing now to try and fix the overhead equipment. It's another to fix the stations, yes, where the buildings themselves have been looted for corrugated iron, for bricks and so on. Some of them have been dug up. I see you've got pictures on your screen there of yes, parts of stations which have been dug up and looted. So it's one thing to fix those. Of course, it's possible to do that. It is possible to fix them. But before you can fix them, you need to put security in place to make sure that it isn't stolen again. And Transnet Freight Rail is already on record as saying, as fast as we replace and repair, so the thieves come in and steal it again. So there's no point in fixing things until there is security. And of course, we have a big country with a long network. Our total network was at its height the 10th biggest in the world, and much of that is not functioning now. Now, to fix things means that you have to make sure that they do not get looted, vandalized again. So here we're looking at a bigger picture. The picture of lawlessness in South Africa, where criminals seem to be able to do things without being caught, let alone tried and convicted. So there's a bigger strategic problem here, whereby government, I think, can't just leave it to PRASA or Transnet or Eskom, for that matter, to guard their infrastructure. It's a nationwide issue where the infrastructure of the country is being looted with impunity. So it's a very complex problem. I think there are people at Transnet and PRASA who are trying to do the right things, but every step forward they're going to go 3 back unless the security issue is fixed.
Yeah, and the parastatal has been haunted by corporate governance failures over the past years, with former CEO Lucky Montana, who himself was kicked out, and who, as PRASA CEO at the time, had appointed Daniel Mtimkulu in 2010, who he said was a genius of an engineer, only to find he only had matric. And the recently fired CEO, Zolani Matthews, was apparently appointed PRASA CEO in contravention of the rail agency's policy that sets an age limit of 63. Now, Mr. Williams, these governance failures compounded the situation even more at PRASA.
Well, that's right. PRASA's had very unstable management. Over the past 15 years, they've had about 10 CEOs, most of them acting. Lucky Montana, as you say, was there for a few years, but he was dismissed. There were big issues with corruption and procurement. There was the famous issue of the trains. You mentioned, Mr. Mtimkulu, the trains that were ordered while he was in charge and the chief engineer were too tall for the South African network and had to be auctioned off. So these issues, the governance issues, have been very serious. What's interesting about Mr. Matthews, Jose Matthews as he is known, he comes from struggle aristocracy, if you like. He's the son of Joe Matthews. He's the sister of Naledi Pandor, who is a cabinet minister. He had an international career, and they've tried to dig up things about him overseas. But what's puzzling here is that when he was appointed 8 months ago, the minister said it was raised that he was too old because by 63 you should retire from PRASA, and those are the rules.
Yeah.
And this was pointed out because he was a year older than 63 when they wanted to appoint him. And the board of PRASA said, no, that's not an issue, we want him. So they tried very hard to appoint him. They didn't give in when this age issue was raised. They bypassed it and they appointed him. And by all accounts, from within the organization, he'd started to do things. He'd only been there 8 months. You can't do much in 8 months in an organization with assets worth 125 billion and thousands of employees. It's very difficult just to make things happen. But he seemed to have started. Now they've suspended and then dismissed him, not on the grounds of incompetence or his age, if they wanted to make that an issue, or some other thing that he'd done in the past or done in the present, but because he has dual citizenship with the United Kingdom. And as he has pointed out, this was never a secret. He was in exile because of the struggle. He was born in England. He got UK citizenship. He also has South African citizenship. For him, it was never an issue. It wasn't a secret. And PRASA claimed that this could be a security issue. Well, it's hard to see how it could be a security issue with passenger railways. And in any case, PRASA and Transnet work with other organizations of railways around the world. So then you have to say, well, if this was dual citizenship, if this was an issue, surely they could have made a plan with that.
Yeah.
If they made a plan with his age. So then the question comes, they're using that to get him out for some other reason. Now, then we start speculating. And this is, again, an example of poor governance, poor transparency. Why have they fired him?
Indeed.
If he's done something that he shouldn't have done, we need to know what it is, not dual citizenship. It's very strange. But the effect is more management instability, more executives who have to sit and are not sure what to do and are looking over their shoulder. And behind all this is that PRASA reports to the Minister of Transport and Transnet reports to the Minister of Public Enterprises. So there's a fundamental clash in operational terms and policy terms and personality terms possibly between those two.
All right, Mr. Williams, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.